Well, in far northern Minnesota, some first responders spent time this morning practicing how they'd handle an emergency long before one presents itself. Up in Eagles Nest Township, located between Ely and Tower, the emergency management team and volunteers held their 6th annual evacuation exercise today. As part of it, 23 of the township's dead-end roads were evacuated, simulating what would happen in the event of a fast-moving wildfire coming from Ely. The goal of the effort is to provide training for the township's road ambassadors, who serve as the main point of contact between the local residents and the fire department. In the event of an actual emergency, it's most likely those volunteers would be responsible for contacting their neighbors to evacuate. Some of the organizations taking part include Eagles Nest FD and the Eagles Nest Committee for Emergency Preparedness and more.